Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. With me today is attorney Steve Chu, and we're going to start nerding out about the new Star Trek Picard series. We're going to do an episode a week after each Picard episode, and this is going to address episode 1, Remembrance. Steve, how you doing, buddy?
Great. Thrilled to be here and super happy to have Star Trek back on the air.
Yeah, this brought me such joy. I can't really explain it. I mean, to go from Mandalorian to Picard, we live in a golden age of nerddom right now, and it's
it's wonderful to see Patrick Stewart return to this iconic role, especially after, it's been so long since Star Trek Nemesis. And that was, reported to be the final appearance of the Next Generation crew. I don't think that many of us expected really to see him back. Although this is not billed as a sequel to Next Generation, it is in the Prime universe, and that's what I love. What I grew up with. So it's just such a thrill. It's like seeing old friends again.
It's well done. It could have been him just talking about wine pairings for an hour, and I would have been ecstatic.
Yeah.
Just to hear that voice. I mean, he could have been, playing fetch, talking to the dog, and I would show up each week with popcorn in hand too.
And I'd be right there with you. Absolutely. He's just an outstanding actor. Done so much for the Star Trek franchise. And I mean, Captain Picard, talk about an iconic figure, truly.
It highlights something good and noble and that optimistic future with the backdrop of this show on what happens when somebody loses faith. Because it's, Star Trek always finds ways to be topical, and this clearly does. Just at a high level, the synth, the rogue synthetic uprising, tragically on the anniversary of First Contact, so that ruins April 4th
Right.
Going forward, of over 90,000 people dying. It's a parallel to 9/11, and
Sure.
And because he wanted to address things like Brexit and the election of Trump, and do it in a way that's Star Trek-fied. And they do a very nice job of addressing those issues of, it's not outright Federation first, but you see cracks in what we used to see from the Next Generation. And that's it's very well done because it's subtle, but you can tell.
Yes. As you said, very topical. You've got all those issues you talked about, as well as the refugee crisis. Which has been addressed, arguably before Star Trek VI with the Klingon Empire. Now we're going through it with the Romulans. Query, what do we do? Like, it says a lot about us, how we react when a historical enemy reaches out for help. What do we do? Really fascinating stuff. Gene Roddenberry was famous for not wanting there to be specific types of conflict, for his box of rules on what he would allow in terms of conflict, and that he wanted Starfleet to represent all that was good in humanity. And DS9, I think, kind of stretched that a little bit, and hence we got some of the greatest stories we've ever had, really, in the pale moonlight and things like that. How far will people go to preserve their way of life? I think we're heading in that direction a little bit here, and that's sort of sci-fi at its best, when we test the boundaries of kind of what we are and how far we're willing to go, right?
Absolutely. Just as DS9 had a refugee episode that is more timely now as compared to the late 90s, it didn't have the same impact because we didn't have these issues, which is just
right.
Why DS9 is so brilliant and forward thinking of like what war can do to a society.
Yes.
And then to go to Picard, being on his chateau with at least 2 Romulan refugees. So he's brought refugees into his life, into his home,
Yes.
and given them a home. And
Yes.
that's just outstanding. It's,
Yes.
again, it's everything good and noble that I love about Star Trek.
Agreed.
So,
Yeah.
well, well, let's talk about the legal issues associated with this, and let's start with the refugee one. That, the Romulan Star Empire asks for help, and the Federation agrees to help them. So, did that create a duty to rescue the 900 million Romulans after the Federation vote to evacuate them to escape the supernova that we saw in Star Trek 2009? And Picard's line, it was downright criminal to abandon the people we were sworn to save. Well, that's absolutely not topical at all. It's, uh, do you want to help discuss what the duty to rescue is?
Sure. So, let's talk about the law a little bit, and then we'll talk about the Star Trek implications here. But the duty to rescue. So, generally, if we're looking at sort of a very, let's look, at the low level. Generally, if we're talking about civil duties, the general rule is that people do not have the legal obligation to help someone else. You don't have a duty to rescue, a duty to assist. There are many reasons for that. But we as a society have generally decided not to impose a legal obligation that would require folks to help other people that are in need. Now, having said that, of course, we often do want to help people that are in need. It's just that we don't have a legal obligation to do so, such that if the person who needs the help doesn't get it, they then cannot turn around and sue people saying, well, you should have helped me and now you owe me tons of money. That's sort of the scenario or the result that the courts and legislatures have tried to avoid. However, we do have, a companion piece there is that sometimes when people try to rescue or help, let's say, you try to give someone a Heimlich maneuver in a restaurant when they're choking, you save their life, but you could also break a rib, and now that person can turn around and sue you. So there are disincentives to trying to rescue or help other people because it could expose you to civil liability. Recognizing that legislatures and courts have recognized a protection, which is commonly referred to as the Good Samaritan law, which essentially protects people who try to help others and thereby may somehow, unintentionally create some injury or whatnot, but are ultimately able to try to help the people. And that there are requirements, legal requirements in this Good Samaritan law and just in the legal analysis. Just off the top of my head, essentially what you have to look at is legally, did you put the person in a worse position? Did you leave them in a worse position than in which you found them? And if so, then you could be in trouble. You could be exposing yourself to some sort of, civil liability. But for the most part, these laws are intended to protect a potential rescuer. Someone, if you give someone the Heimlich in a restaurant and you protect them and save their life, even though you cause some injury in doing so, typically you would be protected. If we look at a larger level, natural disasters, fires, floods, and you try to rescue someone, you help them, and maybe you break an arm or people get injured, but you get them out. Typically, you would be protected. Again, you're trying to help these people. So that's at sort of a very low level, this sort of idea, the duty to rescue. Now we're taking this up many, many levels of magnitude because we're talking about essentially an entire civilization, the planet of Romulus. Let's look at applying this to the Star Trek world now. And obviously, feel free to jump in at any time here, Josh. But we've really hit on one of the key issues of the episode, and just from a Star Trek fan point of view, I absolutely loved the interview because Picard, who is, he's here to talk about the memorial, the remembrance of this Romulan supernova, and we as the audience are wondering, well, why is it that you left Starfleet? And then we learn, and what we get from Picard is the beginnings of a rousing Picard speech. And very few people, I think, can give a speech like he does. Why did you leave Starfleet, Admiral? Because it was no longer Starfleet. And just the fire, the conviction right there, it just gives me chills, because it's like, wow, there he is. There's Admiral Picard, Captain Picard, the moral conscience of the galaxy, if you will.
It's just, I again, it was cheer worthy because it's Space Grandpa opening up, and it's just like, you go, boy, and
Yes.
whatever you say, Papa. Again, like just that feeling of admiration, because it's, on one level, it's a lawyer type argument of, like it's stuff that we do, or more appropriately, what we dream of doing, of being able to make an argument like that, to throw down and say, no, I'm not going to stand by and be a bystander while millions of people die because we go through a tragedy, and our reaction to that tragedy that's not connected is to throw in the towel. And because that's not what the Federation is supposed to stand for. And like, I absolutely get that. Going with the fan Romulan analysis, it's like, okay, we do have the Earth Romulan War, which is sometime during what would be the Enterprise NX-01 series.
Yes.
And that leads to the founding of the Federation. There's no contact for a century, and we see the Romulans again in Balance of Terror. And that is my favorite original series episode.
Yeah, outstanding.
Darmok is number 1 overall, but Balance of Terror is a close second. And maybe depending upon my mood, if I've had dinner, it could flip very easily because it's that good. But like that raised the possibility of two commanders, Kirk and the Romulan commander, not
played by Mark
having a
Leonard.
respect. Yep. There's that respect for each other, and the commander's message at the end where Kirk offers to save them. Because again, that's a very Federation thing, that they don't leave people to die. Even if it's somebody you just fought, there's always that extended hand of, you don't have to die today.
Yes.
We don't have to be enemies. And that rings true in every Star Trek series. Every captain does it at least once with, it doesn't have to end this way. You can come with me. You don't have to die. And the Romulan commander says, in another reality, you and I could have been friends.
Yes, I could have called you friend. Absolutely.
And so there was always that hint of a détente with the Romulan Empire, that it didn't need to be war. And it trades back and forth, and we can, there's always, the debate about, were the Klingons supposed to be the Soviet Union and the Romulan Empire, the People's Republic of China. There's, for the Cold War analogy of potential friends and enemies. And, in our world, we're pretty good at making enemies our friends, because it's the best way to stop continued violence. We're Germany and Japan are close allies now.
Right.
After really horrible wars, and that's the goal. That let's be friends and everyone move forward together, and that's something Star Trek has done very well.
Yes.
So this idea of trying to save the Romulan people so they didn't have to die, and because Romulan colonies were going to get wiped out in the supernova, and to have the Federation have a 9/11 type attack on Mars that kills 92,000. I mean, and fires that are still burning on Mars 20 years later, or a decade later, that's not good. And for the interviewer to take the position of Romulan lives.
Yes.
And Picard fire back, no, lives. It's like you go, Grandpa, just throw down with, and in the way that she had this look of, duh, when he said Dunkirk.
Yes.
It's like, she didn't, again, good poker player, like, what's that? But again, like, good example. Bigger would have been boat lift of, again, which is a 9/11 with getting everyone out of Manhattan and just
Yeah.
tugboat operators, ferries, and anything that floated, getting people off the island of Manhattan after the towers fell. So, because again, that's something we are good at. We as in humans, we rally. When
Yes.
when a disaster happens, we rally because it's who we are. There aren't many people. Well, let me rephrase that. Humans might be the only species to run into a fire to go save someone. Maybe a loyal dog, but you don't. It's just, it's not the Lassie come home or Black Stallion run into the fire to go save people. That's something humans do. And in the idea of trying to evacuate people so they don't die in a supernova is the very human thing. And Picard getting very upset over throwing in the towel uh, because this is problematic for the Federation to agree to do something. We're going to go save you. And then say, we just got attacked, so we're not going to do it. I tend to agree with Picard. It was downright criminal to leave millions of people to die.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, to take the other side of that, and here's why I think this is really fascinating. We've got the decision initially to help the Romulan Empire. And we learned that that is controversial, and it makes sense that it would be because the Romulans are an age-old enemy. So one can imagine the debates that may have happened within the Federation Council among the members, the delegates, that ultimately they did decide, okay, we will extend this olive branch and try to help out an enemy in need. However, that decision would not have been without some detractors and some opposition. And then the real question is, well, how far are we willing to go here? How far does our dedication extend? Because we get this 9/11 event, the synthetic attack on Mars, which destroys the entire rescue fleet. Well, at this point, one could very credibly make the argument that, look, Romulans, we've tried very hard to help you. We built an entire rescue fleet to attempt this Dunkirk evacuation, and we were not expecting to be attacked at the Utopia Planitia shipyards and have them wiped out, because these are the main shipyards for constructing starships. We made a good faith effort. Our entire rescue fleet's wiped out. We need to take care of our own now. We need to lick our wounds, and we just can't help you any further.
That's a good argument for the synthetic attack was an intervening factor that would have been outside of the control of the Federation. Thus, it alleviates the duty to rescue. But with that, like, the clock's still ticking. There's still time to rally. And this was signing the death warrant of 900 million people, saying,
Yeah.
sorry, you're going to die. Not our problem. That's very unlike Federation values. It'd be one thing if it was Romulan terrorists who had destroyed the shipyards, because then it's like, okay, it's an act of war. We're going to leave you to die. But again, it still boils down to, we're going to leave you to die. Even going back to Star Trek 6 with, the Khitomer Conference and, the potential détente or peace with the Klingon Empire, there was the Kirk-Spock debate of, with Kirk saying, with Spock saying, Jim, they're dying, and Kirk responding, let them die. And, Kirk backed off from that position. But it highlights, they made peace with the Klingons. Someone is your enemy if you make them your enemy. And that's not to say that there aren't horrible people out there that, that need to be confronted. I mean, heck, we're lawyers, like that's part of the thing that we do. Standing up for the rights of others, it's what we do. But the entire concept of peace and not making another nation your enemy when you can make them friends, or at least give them a fighting chance for life. Now, it goes to the very values of Star Trek. And I'm like, and that really does have its root in, the Greatest Generation. I'm like, and how that came to fruition to, in the original Star Trek series in the 60s, and how they really doubled down on it with the Next Generation.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack there, Josh, and I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but as you pointed out, we have the prior precedent in Star Trek 6, where if we look at the historical context, Star Trek 6 came out, I think it was 1991, if I recall correctly. We're talking about the time when the Soviets, we were making peace with Russia. The wall has fallen, communism is going down, and we're looking at Russia not as an age-old enemy, a Cold War enemy. We're starting to look at them more as a partner. And can we do that? How are we able to forge ahead with that? Chancellor Gorkin, tells Admiral Kirk at the time, or Captain Kirk at the time, if there is going to be a brave new world, our generation is going to have the hardest time living in it. And he was right. Change is very difficult, but necessary. And then we fast forward to the Next Generation, and we have a Klingon on the bridge. And that is just a shock, for original series fans at the time, but a sign of how far we've come. And now, can we extend that kind of model paradigm to what we've got going on in Picard now with the Romulan Empire? I don't know if people have been reading the Countdown comics. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say, but the two Romulans that are living with Picard actually are Tal Shiar agents from one of Picard's last missions, the mission that is portrayed in the Star Trek Countdown comics. Issue 3 of the 3-part series is going to drop this week, so we don't know how it concludes. But in it, Picard, spoiler alert, Picard goes out to a planet to evacuate some Romulans, and he encounters these two Tal Shiar agents who are the two that are now living in his winery. And we get some very brief scenes of the two of them going to Earth to his winery and saying, we need to help him. We owe him so much. He risked everything for us. We still don't know exactly what he did because we haven't had the last issue drop yet. But there's a real history there. And then again, we get back to where we started this part of the conversation. Picard, with that stirring speech, it was no longer Starfleet. It's not what we are. It's not who we are. That echoes back, and this is a bit of a deeper cut perhaps, but for fans who read, Michael Piller, who was the showrunner of Next Generation starting around season 3, and he also wrote many of the episodes, and he wrote the script for Insurrection, which I think is fair to say is probably not the favorite Star Trek Next Generation movie out there. However, Michael Piller wrote a book about how he wrote the screenplay for Insurrection, and originally he had a lot of ideas, and suffice to say that the final movie was a very different product from what he envisioned. And he had written into the original story a part where Picard learns that Starfleet is doing things that it does not stand for, and Picard gives this rousing speech to the Federation Council, lecturing them, saying, this is not who we are. We have to remember who we are. So even just the brief Picard saying it was no longer Starfleet kind of harkens back to that Picard is our conscience again.
Agreed. And I haven't been reading the Countdown comic, but I've been following some of the articles about it because it sounds wonderful. And
it's very good.
It's again, we have a creative team that understands the character, that understands the prior source material, and that works well for storytelling. And
the one hypothetical question that kept jumping out at me when I was watching Picard and reading the Countdown comic, let us assume just for a moment that the roles were reversed, and let's say that there was a Terran supernova, and we needed help, and we asked the Romulan Empire for help, what do we think they would do?
Let the humans die. I think, well, there'd probably be some debate, and it also depends when. But if it's post, uh, after Spock's reunification efforts and living on Romulus, and after the events of Nemesis, there probably would be at least robust debate about do we do this or not? Because peace is a choice when it comes to foreign policy.
Right.
It's like we could still hold a grudge with Great Britain, and we don't. Like we could have a Cold War with Canada, if we had wanted to, be bitter towards the British Empire. And that's not what we did. Like we made friends.
Right.
And Canadians and Americans travel back and forth and get along. It's it's who we are.
Yes.
And again, Germany and Japan are great examples of former enemies. We're now friends, and we didn't exact revenge. After the war, we didn't do a Treaty of Versailles type, harsh sanctions for the war itself. We rebuilt them and we moved forward. So
Yes.
the idea of what is peace, what is prosperity, what is let's not sow the seeds for a future war by learning to live together and to not antagonize one another. And so much of this boils down to the attack that happens. But let's break this into two. So the first part is, are Romulans refugees because of the supernova? And Bethany Bingford, one of our many legal geeks, wrote a wonderful blog post explaining probably not, because the way that the current laws are written, it's the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees doesn't include environmental disasters. Because no one was thinking about that in 1951.
Right.
Maybe 6 years after World War II, no one thought of that. No one thought about a Mount Vesuvius type eruption taking place. Or it's like, hey, what happened to Pompeii? Like no one thinks in those terms or thought in those terms in 1951. It could be. When I remember being in poli-sci classes at Davis long ago in the 90s, that the idea that there could be future wars over water,
Yes.
because of scarcity of water, that, and again, like armed conflict between the United States and Mexico over water rights, like that, those sort of things still could happen. So it's definitely, I think in the spirit of what is a refugee, they would qualify. Under the current text of international law, we don't include an environmental disaster. But if your home is, again, your planet's going to blow up because of a supernova, you're not going to have a home anymore. Like, it's like there's no homeland to go to. And especially if, how much of the Romulan Star Empire was going to be destroyed. And also that supernova had like a galaxy-wide threat, which was why Ambassador Spock did what he did with the red matter to cause it to collapse.
Right.
So, yeah, quick way of saying, technically, no. Spirit of the law, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And also, if we look for a little bit of Star Trek context here, many of the Next Generation episodes involve the Enterprise going to a planet, visiting and helping them deal with some natural disaster containing, whether it be contain earthquakes, tidal waves, approaching meteor, or something like that. So if we look at it from that perspective, it really is not unusual for the Enterprise or for the Federation to be helping out other planets. But what makes this situation different is that, of course, it's an age-old enemy now. it's the Romulan Star Empire. It's not just a member Federation world or even a non-member world who's just asking for help. In those situations, I don't think there really would be any debate. The Federation Council would just say, okay, we'll send a ship to try and help you. But here, what makes it hard is the history between the two, the two governments.
Well, that, and it's a full-on evacuation of, 900 million people. That's a big number.
Yeah,
And again, they were planning something to take years, because it's not just one planet, it's multiple planets
right,
to be
right.
to be evacuated. So there's, there are differences there. And like our own military has a very proud history of helping people. One example is from the 90s, and this was a presentation I saw as a youth in Sea Scouts that had was the then captain of the Abraham Lincoln, who he starts his command, and there's the volcano that goes off in the Philippines. So their orders are to go evacuate the Philippines. So the first week on the job was, let's go evacuate all these people who don't want volcanic ash and lava coming down and ending their lives. And the talk was amazing, and also hysterical, because people brought their pet dogs. And and there's like hundreds of dogs showing up with all these people, and like aircraft carrier isn't designed to be a kennel. So they he contacts the local admiral and says like, hey, what do we do with all these dogs that are showing up? And the admiral says, okay, I'm gonna go check the book and let you know. And the admiral comes back and says like, well, the rule book says you should shoot the dogs. And the captain said, we're not going to shoot the dogs. And they so they brought all the dogs on board, and they put the the leashes, like with the aircraft tie down straps that that you would use to tie down an airplane. And then they sent the Marine detachment into town to go get dog food. And they came back with lots of dog food, and the captain asked the Marine captain, how'd you get all this dog food? To which the Marine captain stated, sir, if you don't ask, I don't have to lie. And which was later explained that the Marines went and raided every store for all the dog food they could. They took abandoned pickup trucks and brought everything back to the ship. And that's how they saved the dogs and got dog food for them, because it's what we do as a people. So, evacuating an entire planet is a lot different than evacuating cities in the Philippines. But again, there's military precedent for doing that sort of thing, because we're the good guys. It's what we do.
Yeah, no, I think you make some excellent points. I think one could imagine these exact same arguments being made on the floor of the Federation Council in favor of helping Romulus. I would be more curious, just from a narrative point of view, just to see what the discussion would have been like after the attack on Mars. That I think would have changed the context for a lot of people who were saying, look, we need to take care of our own at this point. We've just suffered a catastrophic attack. What good are we going to be helping other people if we can't help ourselves, right?
There's a difference between a catastrophic attack that takes out your shipyards, and again, a large number of people, because 92,000 people dying is 92,000 families losing someone, and that's horrible. But it's not your planets are blowing up.
Yeah.
It's the Federation isn't about to get wiped out by a supernova. So there's still it's an active step to say we're going to leave you to die, and that's abhorrent. And maybe that's why it's the Vulcans that send the jellyfish with Spock to try to say, maybe that's why it's a Vulcan effort, with them going like, yeah, they're distant cousins, and they marched under the Raptors' wings, but we're not going to leave them to die, because that's how we ensure people stay embittered towards you. Uh, Now let's take a look at the synthetic attack on Mars. Do you think that's an act of terrorism?
So I think that, as with some of the major events that have occurred already, we are going to need some more information. We're going to need more facts. Um, and a lot of these seem to be unknown right now because Picard says we still don't know why they attacked. So it's really hard to say. It does seem like it was a surprise, a complete surprise. If we combine this with the short trek, The Children of Mars, where we see the attack on Mars from the point of view of two school children whose parents work at the Utopia Planitia shipyards, it's very clear that this was a complete bolt out of the blue. I think in many ways the 9/11 analogy may be appropriate, but I think we can only take that analogy so far too, because the synthetics, I mean, I guess we have to have a couple of assumptions here, and any of these assumptions could be incorrect. We may find out later on, but the assumptions we have to go based off of, I think, so far are, number one, at some point there were additional artificial life forms created beyond just data before, people that the Soong, that Noonien Soong created. Presumably these were androids created most likely by the Daystrom Institute, which we see is based in Okinawa, under the direction most likely of Bruce Maddox. Query then is Dodge one of these synthetics. Were there, so that's sort of assumption one, is that there are other synthetics out there. Number two, I think we have to assume that they were created by Starfleet, not by other private inventors, or maybe we will find that they were created by people outside the government, like another Noonien Soong. But the only person we know of that was really actively working on this research within canon, within the shows, was Bruce Maddox. So I suspect he's going to play some other role here. And then I think assumption three is that there was some kind of revolt or rebellion, and something led to that type of event. The closest analogy I can think within the Star Trek world right now is the hologram example with the EMHs, from Star Trek Voyager, because at some point we see the holograms working as miners on some sort of workers colony. Did we have something like that happen with synthetic life forms? Did the Federation create a number of synthetic artificial life forms and use them for worker labor, slave labor? This gets all the way back to Measure of a Man, that fantastic legal episode very early in the show. And Picard says to Guinan at that point, we're talking about slavery. If we allow Bruce Maddox to disassemble data and just build synthetics at will, we're talking about creating a slave race. And that's an idea that has really been explored in many other sci-fi properties, notably The Matrix, for example. We create a whole bunch of AIs and they rise up against us. In Terminator, we create Skynet and they rise up against us. It usually doesn't end well, for us when we create a slave race like that. And so query, is that what happened here? We don't know yet. Maybe those gaps will be filled in.
Agreed. There are too many unanswered questions, because normally if there's an act of terrorism, it's calculated to influence the conduct of government. And they rise up and no one knows why. And they do a massive attack that destroys the Romulan rescue fleet. So that doesn't make any sense. So what did the synthetics not want the Romulans saved? That's weird. Like, why wouldn't they want the Romulans saved?
And is that why we have these Romulan assassins out to get a synthetic life form in Dodge? Is this payback? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that's the purpose of the story, which I'm delighted that we get something to talk about.
Yes.
I also like the script flip that Bruce Maddox is, a hero now, because he wasn't a bad guy in Measure of a Man, but he was radically insensitive to Data's needs and what, disassembling Data and Data being concerned with, like, you don't have the skill set to do this, like, you could kill me. And, like, again, legitimate concern for Data's rights. Maddox does like a complete flip because of that interaction. And we have Agnes say something along the lines of, that uprising and then the subsequent ban crushed Maddox and he
Yes.
disappeared.
Right.
So it's like, okay, so I don't think he's, I think this is a horrible thing that just broke him and he went into hiding. Doing, he disappeared to probably continue his work, which is how we end up with the twins. And uh, again, that's fascinating. Uh,
Yes, and it's not without precedent. If we look at the stories of Noonien Soong, and
mhm.
I was looking recently at my old FASA Star Trek Next Generation handbook, officer's manual, and when they introduced Noonien Soong, they say he, after multiple failures, actually retreated to a colony so he could be outside the prying eyes of the scientific community, so that he could just experiment in peace. And then that's when he was able to make Lore first, then Data, and the two Soong androids, and then later retconned with B4. But that's when Soong was able to achieve some success. Query if Maddox is kind of a modern day Soong. Is he following in that path, and has he had some success? I think that we're left so far to believe that Dodge is probably the result of Maddox's work, but we'll find out more over time, I think.
Agreed, because when Dodge talked to her mom, and mom already knew that her daughter had seen Picard, it's like,
Yes.
okay, that's what's going on here. So there are a bunch of things in play. And is
Right.
Maddox actually dad or somebody else who was involved with this, and not just the botanist playing with flowers? So there's interesting questions there. It also raises interesting questions about liability for the rogue synthetic attack, because since the synthetics were made at the Daystrom Institute, and we don't know what they were doing. Like, we don't know if they were fully functional individuals, or it didn't sound like it. They sounded not to the same level of sophistication as Data was. So I don't know where they are on, the robot spectrum of looking alive, but something triggered them to go out and kill. And were they on Mars working? Like what, what's the connection there? And because Picard doesn't sound like they were being exploited. Because if they were being exploited, I'm pretty sure he would have said something. And that he also disagreed with the ban. So again, lots of questions. I do think Datestrom could have some liability issues if they made androids that then go on a killing spree. I think there's a product liability question there with, they're not supposed to go on a killing spree, boys. What did you do? And that raises interesting questions. But the fact they end up
Yes.
with a treaty ban, which means it's not just the Federation, it's other governments that have agreed to ban synthetics, that raises a whole bunch of questions. Never mind the fact that they disassembled B4 and put him in a box. He might have been simple, but he was still, met the qualities of life.
Right. So, unpacking that a little bit further with regard to the liability of the Daystrom Institute, I think a lot of it just depends on how you classify these synthetic life forms. Are they individual autonomous beings, or are they some form of property? And therefore, you can proceed liability-wise against the property owners or creators. If we use the analogy of children, for example, in our legal system, children generally cannot be held responsible for many of their actions. In fact, if a child commits something or causes some damage or injury, the proper remedy, if there is any, is typically to go after the people who are responsible for the child, whether it be the parents or supervisory adults or whoever was just taking care of the child at the time. That sliding scale of responsibility shifts more and more towards the individual as the child ages and presumably becomes more responsible. And that's how our legal system deals with the responsibility of people as they age from children to adults. Now, could we apply that similar scale here? If the more the synthetics are seen as individual autonomous beings, the more responsibility arguably they would shoulder. But if they were just simply more like drones and, just following simple commands, well, then you have a much stronger argument in that situation for liability against their creators, presumably the Daystrom Institute, as the episode says. So again, we have some unanswered questions here that would really turn the question of liability. We just need to know a little bit more, I think, in that area.
Again, which is why I'm so grateful to have the show on, because I'm sure we're going to get that. We'll get that, right?
And the visuals there are fascinating, and I love this issue that we're talking about, this ban on synthetics, Josh. But the visuals, when we see the Daystrom Institute, it's not a busy place. It's a beautiful, beautiful facility, but there is one person working there on that particular day. The whole lab is essentially shuttered down. It's almost amazing that the lab even exists after the attack. We get Alison Pill, who's always a lot of fun. Agnes Girardi, I think, is her name in this, who explains, well, we aren't even allowed to build anything. It's all kind of hypothetical, and we kind of run these experimental models. So then it sort of raises the question, sort of like an Office Space. Well, what is it that you do then, right?
She's just there with her red stapler in the corner. Yeah, it's I'm a people person. Yeah,
I'm a synthetic person, really. I have synthetic skills.
Oh, I love it so much. It is fun, and it's fun to think about, and especially like, again, the long history of Daystrom, going back to the original
M5,
series.
yeah.
With with the war game that goes bad.
Yes,
so
yeah.
There's
the ultimate computer.
Yep. Captain Dunsel.
Yes.
So again, for those who aren't Star Trek fans, we're going deep into nerdery right now. But yes, that's
proudly, yeah.
What do you mean you don't know that term? Yeah, there's a wonderful catalog of episodes you can enjoy. Start now. Yeah, lots of great issues. And again, the floating building that's kind of off the coast is also interesting. It's like, okay, what goes on there?
Right.
I mean, that's an interesting way to keep the minimize building on Okinawa, and if you just have floating structures instead that for environmental impact purposes, that's interesting.
Right. So interesting questions about the ban here, Josh. I mean, can we think of a real world analog? I mean, I guess the closest would be if there were a ban on genetic cloning, for example. These are, bioethics is kind of where we're getting a little bit, the possible creation of new life. If there were a ban on synthetics, and it's interesting that even in the 24th century, we are still somewhat of a reactionary society. The ban is reactive after a disaster, not prospective. But we're responding to a disaster by enacting this sweeping legislation that probably would not have been possible but for this huge tragedy. So now we have this ban on synthetics, and the ban appears to be you cannot create new synthetic life forms. We had discussed this a little bit before even starting the recording today, but does this also mean that, if you encounter a synthetic life form out there, is their life essentially forfeit under this treaty? I mean, how does all this work? There are some interesting questions.
Well, it's okay. Again, B4 is in a drawer, so I'm pretty sure that didn't end well. I also don't think that we would have had the Patriot Act or FISA courts without 9/11 happening, because we weren't proactive and going like, hey, what's a thoughtful way to protect us from terrorist activities?
Right.
We didn't, and instead we overreact, as opposed to, which again, that's very normal, that after a period of relative peace throughout the 90s, we had our proxy war in Iraq, and what happened in Kosovo and in Bosnia, again, a relative quiet decade of peace, unless you were in one of those places where horrible things were happening. and the beginning of the 21st century, we have a terrorist attack on our country, and we flip out. And some of it was necessary, some of it wasn't. But the fact that legislation was ready to go says a lot. And 19 years later, here we are. There is, I think, a historical comparison that could be made here to the eugenics laws that we had in the United States.
Right.
And the famous Supreme Court opinion that dealt with sterilizing people, saying that three generations of morons or of idiots are enough. And at one of the dark sides of the progressive era in the 1910s was the pseudoscience of saying, like, well, people from the Mediterranean area, like have these low sloping brows and thus are of less intelligence, and and people from the Nordic and Germanic countries are supposed to be smarter, and all this crap that was just lies, just absolute BS. And legislation gets passed that impacts how people can procreate. And like this idea of like, oh, criminals shouldn't be able to have kids. Just real sick, twisted stuff that went away. Unfortunately, we inspired the Nazis, and they took US law and cranked it up to 11 with the horrors that they did upon everyone they didn't like in Europe, and which was, again, appalling. So I think banning synthetic life is along those lines. It's a form of eugenics, but with viewing life that's mechanical or biomechanical.
Yes. We also had, going along with the line of precedent that you were talking about, excuse me, we had the Supreme Court step into this issue in a case called Skinner versus State of Oklahoma in 1942. And in that case, the reproductive rights of criminals were raised because there was a law that forced the sterilization of criminals, with the idea being that, well, we don't want you to have any more children because they may be criminals as well. And the Supreme Court said, well, that violates the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, and people do have this absolute right. You can't, rather, the way it's framed is the government does not have the right to take away that person's ability to reproduce. So we have, some people would argue we've got the Supreme Court coming in to be sort of a moral conscience in a way and saying, look, here is the boundary. You can't go past this point in terms of legislation. So if we're looking at, in the Star Trek world here, if we're looking at the ban on synthetic life as saying, well, we cannot reproduce additional artificial life forms, let's apply that for a moment. Let's say Data is still alive and he tries to create his daughter Lal in this environment. Would he be in violation of that treaty, of that law? It seems likely that he would be. So we've now taken away his right to reproduce. What about Data's constitutional rights? He was ruled not to be property, to be a person in measure of a man. So he's got some rights as well, at least.
Agreed. It also raises interesting paternity issues with androids, but I think we'll get to that a little.
Yeah, one complicated issue at a time, right, Josh?
Yeah. This is already going to be a nosebleed and a new legal analysis. So let's pump the brakes and wait for more facts to come in. Here's a cute one, and again, we don't have enough facts to answer it, of how to classify the Romulan attackers upon Daj. And are they state actors? Are they terrorists? Or are they a gang? And I think the best answer is we don't know yet, because we don't know yet. And it's weird for her sister to be working at the Romulan reclamation site if they're not, that would imply that they're not state actors of some kind, because if she's already, within Romulan jurisdiction, why have this kind of a spy network go after her? Like, is this Tal Shiar or something else?
Right.
On the flip side, that one Romulan attacker did, I think, bite down on a tooth in order to do a suicide pill or something along those lines that caused him to spit acidic blood. So again,
Yes.
that was new. That was different.
Also
Very different.
very it was very odd. I replayed the episode. I watched the episode many times, and I replayed the scene of Dodge's supposed death several times. I'm still very confused as to what happened. The attacker has a weapon. She throws him over a bar. He spits at her while she's holding the rifle. And then this appears to be some form of acid that's disintegrating her. And then we get an explosion, which I think is her weapon exploding. And then we just don't see her. So there's no body, and Picard knocks out and wakes up back at his home all of a sudden. And there's a lot of gaps there. The police said they didn't see anyone else. So what happened? I think that there's a strong possibility Dodge didn't die, that she could have been beamed away or something else happened. Maybe she didn't receive enough damage to die and she could have self-repaired somehow. But it's odd how just narratively everyone seems to accept, okay, Dodge is dead. Well, okay.
Yeah, I think that was, this is the one part of the story that I had problems with, of we have her, quote, die, end quote, no body, was she just vaporized in this explosion. But, the 80-year-old survives the explosion that launches him, 100 feet? Yeah, medicine's good, and they probably could fix those type of injuries, but that's we saw she was a really good jumper. We we saw she could make a break for it, and then the twin MacGuffin did cause me to do a double take. That was the only thing that I questioned story-wise in the episode, but I trust where they're going, and we'll just wait for the story to unfold. But that was the only, I did have an eye roll with that, of twins. That did trouble me some.
Yeah, the idea of twins was interesting because we've had that introduced before with lore and data, but now this idea of fractal neurotic twins, okay, so they have to be created in pairs now? I don't know.
Yeah, I trust them. Let's see what they do. But I won't lie, I did roll my eyes at that point. But that was the only eye roll compared to Discovery episode 1, where there were lots of eye rolls. So totally different scenario.
Yeah, lots of joy in this episode.
Yeah, I won't hide my feelings that, it took the Next Generation 2 seasons to figure out what they were doing. And it took
Sure.
Roddenberry leaving in order for the writers to be free creatively to start doing bolder stories that made more sense and that I thought were better. So, they had to save the show from Gene Roddenberry. This starts out strong the entire time. So there's, Discovery took half a season to remember how to make Star Trek. Like, this isn't suffering from that. And that's, I think, because of the lead actor and because of who's involved in making it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, something else we don't have enough to answer the question, but at least we can opine on what does it mean. We have the status of this Borg cube, and it's labeled the Romulan reclamation site. So was this cube damaged in the supernova? Was this the cube that the Romulans used to enhance Nero ship the Narada, because that had Borg technology on it that gave its enhanced weapons? So is that connective tissue there? And what are they doing? Are they just experimenting on Borg? Are they trying to, why are they there, and what's their intent? And why would you call it a reclamation site when it's clearly Borg and not Romulan in nature? And there are satellites around it, either holding it in stasis or in place, and the ship is clearly damaged.
Right. So these are great questions, to which we do not yet know the answer, and that's what's going to make the ride a lot of fun, I think. It's not till the very last shot of the episode that we see the Borg cube. I'll say, just as a fan for a moment here, that the show is not going in the direction that I had expected, because when the show was first announced and you see the other cast members, and we've got we have Jerry Ryan returning as Seven of Nine, although I don't know what her name is, if she goes by Anna, Annika now.
Annika Johansson. Yeah, I would
Right.
hope it's on. I
Maybe,
would
yeah.
hope.
Or if she still goes by Seven, I don't know. And we have Jonathan Del Arco returning as Hugh, who I, love. So when you see those people returning, you're thinking, at least I was thinking, well, okay, there's certainly going to be a large Borg storyline here. If, even if at a minimum, it's going to play a big part in the season, if it's not the overarching theme. But then we also get these references to Data, the synthetic life forms, and I was thinking, well, we may be seeing a Matrix kind of story where we've got a slave race and Picard has to speak out, in their on their behalf. But we didn't get that either, because what we have is just this 9/11 like attack on Mars by the synthetics. So there's a number of mysteries. I wasn't really expecting us to get a Data's daughter type of story, because I'm looking at her thinking, well, I initially thought she was going to be the new Borg queen, and she's connected to Picard through his role as Locutus, and she comes to him for guidance, and maybe now we can kind of take the Borg into a future where they're not as malevolent as they were before. But it doesn't seem that we're going in that direction. It seems that we've got sort of Lal too, in a way, Data's daughter again, and there's that real personal connection to Picard, which I think is terrific. And it's great to have Data. I mean, I wonder if he's going to be relegated to these visions and dreams, or if he's going to actually return, which would be outstanding, if that's possible. So, which is all just a long way of, getting back to the status of the Borg cube. I think that, a couple of assumptions again here. We probably have to assume that this Borg cube was damaged somehow. The Romulans were able to capture it. It probably was the basis for some of the technology used to build the Narada, as was reported in the Star Trek Countdown comic leading up to the 2009 Star Trek movie. That makes a lot of sense, I think. And we don't really have a lot of Romulan Borg conflict on screen. I mean, we have them mentioned in seasons 1 and 2 a little bit, that the Romulans are investigating destroyed outposts, and we later learn, okay, that probably was the Borg. But really, the Romulans end up leaving it to the Federation, to fight the Borg. We don't hear too much about the Romulans tangling with them. So it's likely this was a damaged cube that they found and they rebuilt. Whether it was damaged by the supernova or some other means, we don't know. If that's the case, I mean, let's just come up with a set of facts here. Let's say that the Romulans come across this damaged Borg cube and they take it over. Is it essentially abandoned property at that point? Do they have rights to is it sort of like naval salvage rights? Maybe. It's difficult to envision a scenario where the Borg kind of come up to the Romulans and say, hey, we're going to take you to court. We want our cube back. That's not really the way the Borg work, but if they wanted to try to go that route, would they have a remedy? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah.
Because warships generally belong to their nation. So, which is like why when we found the Bismarck, I was not involved, but when Bob Ballard found the Bismarck, they kept the location secret and treated it as a war grave. With the Borg, I mean, are those satellites masking its location so that way the collective can't find it, that they don't know what happened to it? So, because again, that would be sounding the dinner bell of like, hey, we got a ship here, go get it. There are also bigger issues from how Voyager ended that could have been highly destructive.
Yes.
From, was it Unimatrix Zero, and which was the Matrix type episodes of pertaining to the Borg, and Voyager ultimately getting home, like they leveled a couple crippling blows to the Borg collective.
Yes.
With Janeway's famous line of must have been something you assimilated, of how to break the collective. So
Yeah.
again, we'll see what happens if, like, what's the status of the Borg. I saw one photo of Hugh with his kind of deborged look, so he
Yes.
looks, and that looked awesome.
Yeah.
But pivoting to Data, in Nemesis, the entire B4 line with Data's memories getting into B4 made Data's death a cheat. Like it, because it's like, okay, so there was no sacrifice because we get Data 2.0. And the Picard series undoes that with It Didn't Work. And I read something along the lines that part of Brent Spiner's requirements for coming back was Data's death had to have significance and relevance.
Right.
So him appearing to Picard in dreams makes sense.
Yeah.
Data had dream episodes.
He did.
And fun holodeck episodes. And it would make sense that Picard has this lingering feeling of loss because he was clearly very fond of Data. Data saved his life. And it would make sense that there's that connection there and him being haunted by what's going on. And also the fun issue of dream analysis of when you have a lifetime of knowledge and you're trying to work something out, it's your subconscious that's also helping you figure out you've seen that girl before in a painting.
Right.
And that's after what had to be a horrible night's sleep on his desk of waking up and going like, wait a minute, I'm going to the archives. Like that's I think however they got parts of Data's neural net, I mean, that could have been something Maddox and Data had traded long before Data died.
Possibly. Yeah. Because in the episode Data's Day, he's reporting to Bruce Maddox and giving him an update on how he's doing. So we know he kept in touch with Bruce Maddox, and that says something about Data too. He didn't kind of hold a grudge, so to speak. He found the research interesting and wanted to help Maddox continue.
Well, and it's also the nature of Star Trek of let's not repeat like long grudges. And again, it's the balance of terror of it was their war, not our war. And not to fall into this trap of, let's go fight refight the Civil War. Like, no, let's not. Like, let's not. Or, talking with, again, either, let's say, people in Japan or Germany about the horrors of World War II. Let's not refight the war. It's over. Let's learn from it and let's move forward together. And that's something Star Trek does very well, as evident by the original series, again, having Sulu and Chekhov on the bridge, sending a message of you can have peace and you can have a future together. So again, I'm very grateful to have this series back, or this character back, for at least another 9 weeks, and they're filming season 2.
I'm beyond thrilled to have Picard and all our beloved characters back again. It's outstanding.
Did you see Patrick Stewart on The View with the interactive people?
Yes, and I loved Whoopi Goldberg's reaction. I would love to see Guinan back again, the Alorans, the Watchers, the listeners, really. That would be terrific. The more we see of next generation cast members, I think the greater it will be, so long as they can be woven in organically for the story. But that'll just be wonderful.
Yeah, not nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia.
Exactly. It's got to make sense.
Look here. It has to be meaningful, and it has to be touching. Yes. And just the way that they interacted on The View with her getting up and going over and hugging him and saying yes. It's just like, oh, it's just nerds across the country all sobbing hysterically.
Yes, loved it.
Again, standing ovation, and that looked like there were more people in the audience who were Trek fans than that they normally would have at a recording of The View.
Yes, yeah, it was
All good.
wonderful.
Yep. So with that, we stay tuned for more. We'll cover these weekly in addition to other topics. But for now, we do have a Patreon. If you enjoy our podcast, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you enjoy your podcasts. And everyone, stay geeky, America.